Hello, and thank you so much for joining me in this interview with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. So, we have an incredible conversation coming up for you. It's super informative. There's a lot of really interesting science and some really, in my opinion, helpful takeaways about HRV or heart rate variability, how to interpret that data. Let's say if you are checking your HRV or if you have a wearable device like a Garmin or an Oura Ring. So we get into a lot of the nitty gritty of what that information means and how you can apply it. If you happen to have POTS or dysautonomia or you're hypermobile, you're a member of that particular club, as I am, we also get into how HRV applies to dealing with chronic conditions and measuring your readiness for fitness. And we also step a little bit away from HRV to talk even more about tolerance to exercise. So whether your interest is just more in HRV and training, or it's more specific to POTS and dysautonomia and hypermobility or chronic conditions, we cover both in this interview. So there's kind of something for everyone. With that, I just wanted to give Dr. Mike a little plug. At the end of this interview, he mentions that he has a couple certifications as well as an HRV course. I've taken both the HRV course and I've completed his Flex Diet certification, which is on metabolic flexibility. If you are a coach or someone who is in nutrition and fitness and you're interested in better understanding human metabolism, fat metabolism, carb metabolism, body composition, all those things, it is a very thorough course. So I would say if that's an interest of yours, definitely check it out. Finally, if you are interested in getting back into strength or being more consistent with strength, I did want to give you a heads up if you haven't seen it yet that I do offer a week of free customizable workouts that can be scaled up or down. So you can make them easier if you need to account for things like chronic conditions or hypermobility, or pretty challenging if you're more of an intermediate exerciser and you're using things like barbells already. If you're interested in grabbing that, you can do it by just visiting the link in the show notes or the description. Same with all of Dr. Mike's stuff. I've linked it all below wherever you are watching or listening to this. And then also, if you're interested in my app-based program, Total Package Strength, just a heads up that I am going to be reopening enrollment for it sometime this month, June 2024. Those customizable week of free workouts is a really nice preview of what you can expect inside the app, except it's PDF-based. So if you're at all interested in that, now is a great time to test out those workouts to see if they're a good fit for you. And that'll also have you put you on my list so you can stay in the know and just learn more about the program, be aware of when enrollment opens. So thank you so much for being here. That's kind of it for my announcements today. And let's go talk to Dr. Mike. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Results Not Typical. Super stoked to have Dr. Mike with me today. We are going to talk about all things HRV, how to analyze it, what it is, and we'll dive a little bit into sort of the parameters of how you might want to use it if you have POTS or dysautonomia or some chronic conditions. So welcome, Dr. Mike. Thanks for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So before we sort of get into all the technical stuff that we can get into, do you mind just giving a short intro about who you are and what you do and why HRV is of interest to you or an area of expertise?
Yeah, how I got an HRV is I did a undergrad Bachelor of Arts in Natural Science, and then did, 2 years I did a postgrad program for mechanical engineering. Ended up doing my master's in mechanical engineering, and then decided I didn't want to do any more math really per se, but then I started doing a PhD in biomedical engineering, got really tired of math, so I switched to the exercise physiology department. And then literally day one, the advisor said, hey, we got 2 new projects. They both involve math, and there's only like 5 people in the department. And he kind of pointed at me and said, you, math boy, these are your projects now. And they were on metabolic flexibility and heart rate variability. So I kind of fell into it at that point. I was a little bit familiar with HRV through Omega Wave and through some other systems that had been used before that. And then currently, I do some analysis for the people over at Rapid Health. I teach for Rocky Mountain University, associate professor at the Carrick Institute. They primarily do more clinical neurology. I have a couple certifications, a Flex Diet cert and a PhysFlex certification I created, an HRV education course, and then I still work with some clients one-on-one, and probably a few other things I'm forgetting.
Fair enough. But suffice to say, I would say you have a good mix of technical knowledge and practical application, having worked with real humans, which I find is always very valuable because both are important in terms of the application. Because sometimes, research will say one thing and then we're like, cool, but how does that apply to actual humans?
Yeah, I started, I'd say, officially training people in 2005. I did my NSCA CSCS.
Awesome. So let's just start here. For anyone who has no idea what heart rate variability is, what is it and why should we care?
Yeah, I mean, simply HRV is a good way to determine the status of your autonomic nervous system. Those people probably know there's two branches of the autonomic nervous system. One is the parasympathetic side, which is like pushing down on the brake pedal on your car. You push down on the pedal harder, or you increase something which is called vagal tone, and then the car slows down. So in this case, your heart rate would slow down, kind of like the rest and digest side of the nervous system. The other side is the sympathetic or stress side. This is like pushing down on the gas pedal of the car. As you increase that, your car is going to speed up. So heart rate, contractility, other things like that speed up. So the sympathetic can be thought of more as the stress side of the nervous system. And HRV is a really good way to determine what part or what side the nervous system is more kind of biased towards. Are you kind of more on the parasympathetic side, or are you kind of more on the sympathetic side?
Absolutely. And I think what's kind of interesting about that is, generally speaking, I think a lot of people are going to land more on sympathetic side, just because our environment, day-to-day life can be kind of stressful. And I know this is high sympathetic tone is one of sort of the markers of folks who are hypermobile and have things like dysautonomia or POTS. But one of the more interesting things to me about HRV too is that what you're actually, I believe, and maybe we can use this to get into this idea of how to interpret the data and how to measure it. But one of the things I thought was really interesting when I started learning about it was that you don't want it to go from being kind of in the sympathetic mode to like suddenly like all the way down in parasympathetic after like one really stressful day or week. So it's not just like one number good and the other number bad. You're sort of trying to step back and look at more of a trend, I believe.
Yeah, my little golden rule of HRV is that the HRV will tell you the status of your autonomic nervous system at any time that you take the measurement. So if I took my measurement after some highly stressful exercise, it's going to say, shocker, hey, you're really stressed. You're on the sympathetic side. But that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, because I would want to induce some stress via exercise or hard training. Same thing if you get too far on the parasympathetic side. You can end up with something called parasympathetic overreaching, where maybe the next day after hard training or high stress, your number can be very high in the parasympathetic side, not just a little high, but quite high. Usually you feel more tired, lethargic, etc., that type of thing. So you've kind of swung a little bit too far away from the baseline. Sometimes if you're doing hard training or you have high stressor events, this can be a quote normal thing to happen. But early on, I thought, oh, I was always told that the higher the number, the more parasympathetic you are, that this is, and in my little air quotes, better. And so I started doing silly things that would acutely increase my parasympathetic tone. Like one of the more stupid things I did was I was training for a strongman event. I didn't have access to the equipment. It was the middle of winter, so I was training in my garage. I was trying to simulate like kind of a medley of doing one exercise back to back for 60 to 90 seconds. So I thought, well, I'll put 225 on the trap bar and I'll do, sets of 25, which is horribly stupid hard. And then I started doing repeat sets of this. Probably good for strongman training. But when I looked at my HRV the next day, I was like, oh, holy crap, this went up like 12 points. That's interesting. Oh, so I must be recovered. And then I did it the following week. I went up 11 points again. Oh, this is great. I found some secret parasympathetic recovery tool. And so then I started doing it twice a week. And then 6 weeks into this little experiment, I was sleeping 11 hours a night. I felt like dog crap and all my other lifts had dropped and I couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. And I'm like, but when I look the next day, my HRV is better. But when I looked at 48 hours later, it would go up and then it would drop well below baseline. And to your point, my average over the course of those 6 weeks was definitely down in a very sympathetic direction. So the mistake I made was only looking at the response the next day, not the day after, not looking at the overall average of 7-day or 30-day or whatever you want to use. And what I was seeing was that parasympathetic overshoot, meaning that, yeah, I did something very stressful, normally high intensity work in the lactate area, 30, 60, 90 seconds of continuous work will almost always elicit that response in most people, which again, if you are training and you are doing that on purpose and you know that and you take the next day or the next day easy, that's fine. But in my case, I was only looking at that 24-hour period post and basically kind of overreached and added a whole bunch of unnecessary stress to myself.
Yes. And I think that's a great example of how context matters. And that's why
Yep.
you need more than a number to decide what to do with it. You kind of have to think about, like, okay, well, what was the scope of this day or week when you're looking at the numbers? So, in a general sense, if let's say someone decides to sort of start paying attention to their HRV, I know there's a few different ways. Like, you can do it with like a heart rate monitor on an app, or you can, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. A lot of people now have like a Garmin watch or an Oura Ring that sort of, it might not be using HRV language specifically, but it's giving you a sense of where you are. What should someone look for maybe just when they're getting started and they're trying to interpret this data for themselves?
Yeah, so I have a Garmin watch, I have an Oura Ring, I do Oura Ring analysis for the guys at Rapid Health. It depends on the context and what you're trying to do. So my general rule of thumb is if you're just trying to get like a ballpark rating and your resting heart rate is not super low at night, so you're maybe in the high 50s or so, you can probably get by using an Oura Ring or using a Garmin. It'll definitely get you into the ballpark. However, if you really are trying to get specific to look at the stressors the day before, maybe you're training hard or you've got some illness or POTS or something that you're really trying to get more granularity, and your resting heart rate is quite low, then the measurements that are being accumulated over the course of the night are probably not going to be, they're still accurate, they're just not as representative of the stressors the day before. So for most of my clients, I still have them do what's called a commanded measurement first thing in the morning. I use the iFleet app. Instead of athlete, it's iFleet with an I. So you put a little heart rate strap on, usually do the measurement seated first thing in the morning, sit comfortably for 1 to 2 minutes, hit start. It'll take 60 seconds to do the reading, and then it'll actually pace your breathing at a specific rate. So it kind of takes any changes with breathing out of the equation. So with that, you will see a little bit more representation of stressors the day before. Most of the literature up until recently has almost always used that method because we didn't have fancy methods of accumulating the data overnight, with the rare exception of, in hospital and in lab stays and that kind of thing. So if you want to get a ballpark, I think Oura Garmin might be useful. You have to make sure that it's only accumulating over the course of the evening. I lost track of what Apple Watch is doing for HRV now. They seem to change it all the time, so I can't keep track of that. But if you really want to do analysis that takes a little bit more time, it is more representative of the stressors the day before, and you've got a relatively low resting heart rate, you probably have to do some type of measurement to do what's they call a commanded measurement, do it first thing in the morning in a seated or sometimes standing position.
Yeah, and I think I followed all of that, but I'm going to ask a follow-up question for someone who's listening because it popped in my brain. So I also, like, I have a Garmin, for example, and I know
Nice.
I run towards high sympathetic tone, and I have POTS, so I'm kind of the audience to a degree.
Yeah.
So what I've observed is during the day, I'm like all orange. So I'm like all stress responses with like a teeny bit of blue, unless I like purposefully like lie down and breathe. And then at night, like typically it's like pretty blue unless I drank a whole bunch of caffeine or I did something kind of dumb where I would expect my sleep to be a little bit fucked. So I'm wondering, you mentioned you're sort of looking at the information at night. Are you saying that sort of the night information is maybe more useful or representative of your recovery than the day information? Or does it help to sort of look at the whole scope of it?
Yeah. For Garmin and Oura, even potentially Apple Watch, I don't look at any of the daily information at all because there's way too many things that'll affect your stress level. So, like on Garmin, it'll give you an overnight HRV. So that's the number that I would take. Aura does the same thing, gives you your overnight HRV. The reason that that's most useful is because that's going to be the most stable period for data capture. You're not getting up in the middle of the night, probably drinking a ton of water. You're not eating. You're not drinking coffee. Your sleep may change a little bit, which is the downside of that. If you have a very short night of poor sleep, obviously that's going to, not only is it going to directly affect your HRV because it's affecting your autonomic nervous system, it's also capturing data over a different time course and a different time period. So that makes it a little bit wonky. You can look at the stress score on Garmin during the day. I usually don't have clients ever look at it. If you do, you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt that, okay, what am I doing? Am I working on a stressful project? Am I just hanging out relaxing? Am I going for a walk? Am I exercising? Did I just drink 2 cups of coffee? Right? Even things like consuming like a half a liter of water in a short period of time will acutely change your HRV. There's a lot of stuff during the day that will modify your HRV. So I don't really find daily measurements of it are all that useful.
That's really helpful to hear because I personally just observed that I was all orange and then ignored it because I was like, well, this isn't practical, then I'll never train again. But I know a lot of people probably take it to heart. So I think it's helpful to have that extra context. So thank you for that.
Yeah, the biggest thing is you want to capture the data after the most stable period, which for 99.9% of cases is going to be in the morning. Like Garmin and Oura will do that automatically for you, or you can, sit down and do a commanded measurement to grab the data at that point.
Awesome. So I think that leads in kind of nicely to one of the listener questions I got, which was how much of HRV is individual and how much should you sort of assess or weigh the numbers versus just how you feel when deciding to do something or at what intensity?
Yeah, it's a good question. So again, HRV will only tell you the status of your autonomic nervous system at that one point in time. So when I have a new client, we're going to look at their average HRV for probably like 4 weeks before we really do anything. We want to know what is their average because it's going to go up and down. iFleet has the advantage of having little context indicators below it. You'll self-report sleep, nutrition, recovery, muscle soreness, that kind of thing. So when I get that data, I can look at the context of also what's going on. So if they had a very high stress day, do they historically report poor sleep? How do they feel, etc.? So we're trying to calibrate those because acutely you can be a little bit higher stress, and most people will report feeling a little bit better. If you are, say, for example, massively parasympathetic, most people will then report that they feel tired, lethargic. If you look at their training performance, usually the training performance is down. So again, that might be useful if we're really wanting a hard recovery day. Yeah, I might have someone just have a super high parasympathetic tone that day. They just do some walking or whatever. If we did that on purpose. So you have to look back and go, okay, mainly I'll sort between is it training stress or is it lifestyle stress? So more of the higher level athletes I work with, their training stress is going to be their number one stressor, hopefully. So most things we're looking at is going to be modifying their training stress. Is it where we expected? Did it drop today? Oh, great. You're just doing a light cardio day. No worries. Okay, Wednesday's a heavier day. We want to make sure you're back to baseline or above for Wednesday. Most people outside of that, it's normally their lifestyle stressors that are going to be higher. Their sleep was poor. They have maybe some disease they're working with. The dog's running around and chasing cars, or the kids are crazy, or whatever it is, right? The nutrition choices are poor. They don't like water, whatever. So it's usually lifestyle modifications that we're working on to try to get their HRV chronically a little bit higher and probably even it out a little bit. So again, that's the hard part with HRV is everybody wants the answer of, oh, do I train today or do I not? Oh, is it good? Is it bad? Is it warm? Is it fuzzy? And I've had clients train on what would look like an absolute horrible HRV day. But historically, we know what we're doing. We know what stressors we're applying to the body, and we're okay. Most people, if they have a very, let's say, high stress day, but they're like, because of their schedule, they can only train maybe 3 days a week. Am I really going to tell them not to go to the gym that day? Probably not. We might modify volume. We might modify some other things. So again, it goes back to the context of what you're looking at. So I'm looking at the score. Are they more parasympathetic? Are they more sympathetic? And then what do we have planned for that day? Okay, today is a really intense training day, and you got to drop 4 kids off at soccer practice, and you're running around all day. Yeah, I might kind of expect the next day is going to be a higher stress day. So we may give you 2 days off and then train 2 days later in the week, right? So retrospectively, I'll try to look and set up their schedules so that over time, they are getting some training in, they're getting some lifestyle modification, but we're not, slitting all 4 of the tires and, putting the car into the ditch like every single day either.
Right. So what I hear you saying is if you have some control over your schedule and when you train, maybe don't put your super hard training day on the same day that your schedule is nutso and you've got a million things going on.
Yeah, and and sometimes you kind of have to, right? So again, you're always looking at, okay, what is the risk? What is the reward? And you're trying to even those out. And then over time, you're looking, it's like, oh, can we do some things to change their sleep quality? Can we do some nutrition changes to try to increase that? At the end of the day, maybe the only thing we can change is training. So one of the weird emails I get from randos off the internet is, oh, all you ever talk about is just changing their training for people. Like, don't you know you could change a whole bunch of other stuff because of HRV? I'm like, that's true, but the assumption there is it's a lot easier for them to change their training than it is to be like, oh, hey, Bob, I want you to, completely fix your nutrition, which was effed, and fix it by tomorrow. Great. Have fun with all that. Right. Like you said, it's normally the thing that's most modifiable acutely is the thing that we're going to change. And it just turns out for most people, whether you're a high level athlete or not, most of the time that's going to be your training, right? That maybe go to the gym and just walk on the treadmill for 40 minutes possibly, or we'll cut your volume in half, or we'll take the intensity down. Like rarely am I have somebody probably not train. But in general, for most people, especially when they're busy, training is usually the most modifiable thing that they can change on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. But for someone who is, let's say, looking at working on their HRV over time, what would you say for someone who wants to do that? What are some of the things that maybe they could implement in terms of, say, nutrition or sleep? Or we haven't really gotten to it, but I know cardio, for example, can play a role in that, and it's not necessarily hit. So do you mind maybe speaking to those things so people kind of understand how all of those lifestyle factors or choices can fit into affecting your HRV?
Yeah. So the analogy I use is there's 2 categories. So imagine your HRV is like a bucket, and you're trying to fill as much water in the bucket. And the water in the bucket represents your HRV baseline. Step 1 is most people just have a bunch of holes in their bucket. Like their nutrition is a disaster. They sleep 4 hours a night. They drink 8 cups of coffee. Like all those things are basically holes in your bucket where you're just oozing stress everywhere. So of course, get better sleep, make some changes to nutrition, increase micronutrition, etc. So the things that are been as sort of acute stressors, fix those things or change them in a better way so that it's less stressful. So you have a smaller hole in the bucket. So for example, if you sleep 5 hours a night, maybe 6 hours a night, that'd be a huge win. If you're eating 20 grams of protein a day, hey, even 40, 60 grams of protein a day is going to be helpful. If the only green thing in your diet is green colored Skittles, like have some spinach for lunch, right? Do those kind of, very kind of common, boring type stuff. Now, if you want to increase the size of the bucket, then you're looking at things that have more of a chronic adaptation. And at the top of the list, I would put some type of breathing mechanics. Anything you can do to breathe more efficiently, that will see a pretty big change in HRV. That's probably modified a little bit more through RSA, respiratory sinus arrhythmia, but you will see changes in increasing parasympathetic tone. The other big one, like you mentioned, is just your cardiorespiratory fitness. It can be monitored and measured by your VO2 max. So what is the level of your aerobic metabolism or your aerobic system? If it's really, really low, then most of the time your HRV is also going to be quite low. So over time, we can modify that by trying to increase your VO2 max, which is just the number of how big the size of your aerobic engine. If we can make that bigger in general, that correlates to having a better or more parasympathetic HRV score over time.
Right. And when we're looking at cardiovascular fitness, let's say for someone who is less conditioned, we're not talking about someone who's like a cardio athlete. Where, again, I know that it's going to depend, but in a very general sense, where would you say people start? Because sometimes people hear cardio and there's so much confusion on the internet now about like zone 2 or steady state versus HIIT. So what's kind of your take on that?
It kind of depends on where they're at. So let's say if their VO2 max is really horrible, like they're 25 milliliters per kg or below, so it's like really low, do anything. I don't even care. Walk the dog, do zone 2s, do zone 3, probably fit in a little bit of zone 4, higher intensity stuff. You could do a class. As much as I don't like lifting weights faster, you could probably do some of that. Like anything, you're going to see an increase. So those people don't really have to worry too much about it. Just do something you would classify as cardio. I don't even care really what it is. Once you start getting up to, maybe the 30s, low 40s, now you probably have to be a little bit more specific. You could start with a very base of zone 2, which is very low intensity cardio, something where you could have a conversation as you're doing it. The caveat is you're probably going to want to accumulate 2 to 3 hours of zone 2 per week. That's probably more than what most people are going to do. I can watch Netflix. You can do something like that. So on the psychology side, that's pretty hard to convince a fair amount of clients because they won't necessarily feel substantially better 6 weeks after it. Some of them do, but it's just like building that base of the pyramid. Most people, I would actually start with what I call cardiac development work, which is about like a zone 3. So it's something that is more intense. It'll be hard for you to finish a full sentence when you're doing it, but you can sustain that output for 10, 20, maybe 30 minutes, depending upon if you're biking, running, rowing, depending on what it is. So it's something that is a higher intensity. It's definitely not high intensity work, but you want to accumulate time in that area. And then I would add probably just once a week, some type of high intensity interval training. So this would be in the literature, you'd look at what's called 100% of your VO2 max. This is pretty heavy work to do for 2 to 8 minutes in duration. And if you then want to repeat that with full rest, you can go again. So a real simple one I have clients start at if they're using the rower, warm up, go pretty hard on the rower for 2 minutes, monitor how far you go in distance, and then rest completely. So get off the rower, walk around, let your heart rate recover, go again and try to hit at least 10% of that distance that you did the first round, because you don't want to see this massive drop off in output. And then you can work up to doing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rounds of that. Once you feel pretty good with that, then you can go to, like, say, 3 minutes, and then go to a 4 minute. There's nothing magical about any of the protocols. There's like the Norwegian 4x4, which is 4 rounds at 4 minutes. But you're going to need some higher intensity work for probably about 2 to 8 minutes at that intensity. I like doing a full recovery and then go again. The good part is you probably only need to do that about once per week. The caveat is whatever that output is, you want to make sure you repeat that output and get very, very close to it within 10%. Otherwise, what happens is people are just like, I did the crazy Tabata thing and I beat the crap out of myself for, 4 rounds of, 4 minutes each, which definitely can be very, very hard. But if their output was, say, averaging 200 watts, and then after round 4, they're averaging like 100 watts, your output just tanked a little bit too hard. So I don't want to see that much of a performance drop off because I want to see a higher quality work that's held at that output, even if it means resting longer in between. Because most people just turn it into something that feels really hard, but they're not looking at how much total work they're accumulating over time.
Yes. So you're kind of describing that classic paradox of working to get better versus working to get tired.
Yep.
Because working to get tired will feel really hard, but your
Oh,
body
definitely.
can't necessarily recover from it. And that's going to be problematic in terms of seeing actual results.
Yeah, because you want an adaptation. That's the reason you're training, right? You're training for the adaptation. And the way to get the adaptation is to get close to the output that you were doing before. And there's more advanced methods. There's incomplete rest, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff. But the biggest mistake I see people make is they're like, oh, I heard the 4x4 is the greatest thing ever. So they do it. It's very, very hard, but their output drops substantially. So they might have been better at even just starting at just like maybe 2 rounds at 4 minutes each, which if you haven't done that before, it's pretty challenging. Because over time, you have to either do more volume, do more density, or do a faster rate. Right. So at some point, you have to provide what's called progressive overload to it also. Doesn't mean it has to be from one session to the next. It just means over time, you should actually get better at putting an output out.
Yes. And I think the other takeaway there is that it's not that one type of cardio is superior to another, it's that both probably have their place in training.
Yeah, and most people do too much high intensity work at too low of a quality. Like I would much rather have someone do like very high output work one time a week than do kind of shitty output twice a week.
Right. Yeah, I mean that makes sense. So thanks for sort of teasing that out because I think there's a lot of confusion in that world. So
Yeah.
that's kind of a little bit more general. If we get a little bit more specific, right? And this actually again leads into another question I got, which I thought was good, which is sort of exercise tolerance and POTS.
Mm-hmm.
Because as we know, it's easy to flare yourself. It's easy and end up feeling worse at the end, and it's sometimes hard to gauge how much to do. So what this person asked was, when trying to work your way up to more exercise tolerance, is there a max heart rate or any HRV sign to look for that would tell you to stop or dial back, both for strength or cardio?
Um, I would say there's not really a hard marker, which makes it hard because it's gonna be different per individual. My advice, however, would be whatever you think you're gonna do, like cut it in half or even a third and start there. Because way too many people just go way too hard and they won't know the entire cost until after the session and most likely the next day. Right. And then retrospect, they're like, oh man, I went too hard. Yeah, I don't feel so good today. And then they're kind of not doing anything for like 2 to 3 days, which is fine. I mean, that happens, but then you usually have to scale like way back. Like I've had some people were cleared by their, functional neurology to, neurologists to start doing exercise and were extremely intolerant of exercise. So I literally said, okay, let's get on the rower and let's literally do 20 minutes today. I'm sorry, 20 seconds today. And then let's wait tomorrow and see how you feel. If everything feels great, then try 25 or 30 seconds. They're like, what? This is stupid. I'm not going to get any adaptation from this. Like the whole point, you will get some adaptation, not a lot, but you have to stay under the threshold. And we have zero idea where your max capacity is. All I know is the report I got from your neurologist who says you're incredibly intolerant of exercise. So I'm going to start. I've even had clients who were really bad, not do anything. Like, okay, your job is to get up in the morning and I want you to sit on the rower and I just want you to breathe and not even exercise. They're like, what are you, insane? Like, this is stupid. I'll get no adaptation from this. It's like, well, you kind of had an issue before where you burned yourself out. You happened to do it rowing. And so I want you to just literally become more parasympathetic in that environment so that you don't get more of the psychological stressor from it before we even have you start adding exercise. Now, again, some people can do 2 minutes, some people can do 5 minutes, some people can do a half-hour strength training. The gamut is just like massively wide. So look at average heart rate during your session, whether it's strength training or aerobic stuff. In general, the higher the heart rate, the more stressful it will be. Not always, but it's a good rough guide. So look at your average heart rate, look at your max, and then look at your HRV score the next day. Are you above baseline or below baseline? So if you're above baseline, you have a higher HRV. That means you're more on the parasympathetic side. If it's lower, then you're more on the sympathetic side. Now, again, depending upon what measurement system you're doing, that's where it gets a little bit tricky. If I'm using the iFleet system, if I see a drop of like 5 to 10 on the iFleet system, I'm like, that's pretty stressful. Or if I see a drop of like 8 to 10, it's pretty stressful. Garmin, probably, 5 to 6, somewhere in there. Again, that doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that, okay, like that was pretty stressful to your body. So maybe let's take a day off and maybe let's just repeat that exact same thing we did again. And let's take another day off and let's repeat that exact same thing we did again. And over time, do we see less of a cost to the thing that we were doing? If it was incredibly stressful, then okay, we definitely need to scale back. So I would say just take your volume and just cut it in half to start. Again, you're trying to get below whatever that threshold is, which you don't know. So you're kind of playing around and it's like throwing darts at a dartboard, but you don't know where it's at until after the dart leaves your hand. And then over time, you'll figure out where that threshold is. And it might be different for high intensity cardio, moderate intensity cardio, or even lifting weights also. So you kind of have to play around with it. And the biggest mistake I see people make is they start way too far. And then they're like, oh man, I was after like 4 days. This is stupid. So let me try again next week. Okay, I would advise you start way down on the scale and slowly work your way up. That's just easier than constantly burning yourself out, waiting 4 or 5 days to recover, and then doing it again and doing it again after that.
Yeah, I call that the revolving door, and it's kind of a nightmare.
Yep.
I observe the same thing when working with clients. A lot of the time, your ego thinks you're going to be in one spot for better or worse, and your tolerance is your tolerance, and you have to honor the window of tolerance, not what you can physically do. Because I find that in these situations with things like POTS, dysautonomia, chronic illness, the amount you can do is far greater than the amount you can tolerate and recover from. And so it's one of those things where you have to be really patient and very slowly close that gap, but it's also incredibly individual on what that starting point is. And there is you just kind of have to mess around with it until you figure out what it's supposed to look like based off of kind of what you described there.
Yeah, and we're looking for what's called a eustress, not a distress. So eustress, eustress is stress you can apply to the system to get an adaptation, but you can generally recover from in a short period of time. Distress is a high amount of stress that's applied to the system that takes you a long period of time to recover from. And most people I've noticed is the gap between their eustress and their distress is really high. Meaning that if you told them to do something very stressful, they could definitely 100% go out and execute it. But the cost that they would pay would be, I'm not really doing anything for 1 to 13 days sometimes, right? And what we want is a eustress where, okay, go to the gym, do some positive adaptations, get some good output, maybe take a day off, and then let's go back and do it again. And then let's go back and do it again. So I'm a big fan of pushing frequency as high as possible, but you're still trying to stay under that sort of mythical threshold so that your cost that you're paying is not so exponentially high, and that you can start to accumulate a high quality work over the course of a week, month, and year.
Right. As opposed to only getting one, we'll call it dose of exercise every 13 days because that single dose takes you out for that long.
Correct.
So while we're on the topic of kind of POTS and dysautonomia, are there any other things that you think would be helpful for people to know about sort of evaluating or managing that during exercise with tolerance that's going to be helpful or not so helpful if they do it?
I mean, the biggest things I've noticed is that it's incredibly individual. Some people respond really well to zone 2 cardio. Some people don't. High intensity work tends to be more hit or miss. Strength training is more hit or miss, but I do like strength training with more complete rest. Like, yeah, I tend to, if I don't know anything, will program actually heavier loads, but mostly complete rest. So yeah, by all means, like do a heavy, triple or a set of 5, rest completely, maybe go again, and then move on to a next exercise, which seems to be counterintuitive to a lot of what people have been told. Like they're like, oh, just do super high rep stuff with short rest periods. And I find that doesn't work very well at all, because and again, you can kind of get at this by looking at average heart rate, where your heart rate peaks, that kind of thing. The other part too is if they have any rehabby type drills from their neurologists, like eye movements, head movements, vestibular, whatever they're working on. Those can be incredibly fatiguing, but they just don't register. Like, I mean, I've done a fair amount of like functional neurology just on myself for some eye issues I have. I've done like a couple weird looking eye exercises, and I've torched my HRV for 3 days after that. If somebody watched me do it, they'd be like, okay, you didn't do anything. But to my neurology at that time, it was incredibly stressful. And it got better over time. You know, now I can do a fair amount of them many years later. So don't always look at what it looks like or even the amount, air quotes, of physical work that's being done. Some of the things can have a high cost. Obviously, if they're prescribed for you, there's a reason that they want you to do them because they are beneficial. But one of the mistakes I made was assuming that, oh, these can't be that neurologically intense. And then I remember after one session, literally drinking like a whole thing of coffee, like, and wanted to take a nap in the corner and felt like I got hit by a Mack truck for 4 days.
I can co-sign that. I have fried my synapses doing those vestibular PT exercises. Like you have, and again, I just point this out because I make the same mistakes everyone does. I was like, this is nothing. And then like could not function for 5 days because, so out of curiosity, what is going on for anyone who's wondering when you do this thing that's basically an eye movement and then like suddenly you have to take a nap for a week? Why is that?
Ooh, nobody really knows, to be honest. What I have noticed is I've gotten more intelligent about it and worked with professionals that are better and just, for example, I'm lucky. I'm in Minnesota. So I did a lot of work with Dr. Jeremy Schmo, who's out of Minnesota Functional Neurology. Awesome guy. And so I've worked with him enough now, and he's really good that we can titrate stuff where I can do a fair amount of volume of it without just getting completely blown out of the water. Having a bigger aerobic system helps a lot with that. Having a better lifestyle, all that stuff helps. My guess is that the only way I can describe it sometimes is if you've done a lot of that functional rehab work, like you feel like you've gone in a better direction. And I feel like my whole tissue and body is reorganizing to get caught up to where my neurology is, if that makes any sense. Like I feel like my movement was better, everything was more fluid, breathing was better. HRV did go up, but the cost of it was I was super tired. I felt like I could eat everything in the house. I couldn't sleep long enough. I felt better, but I also felt an incredible high level of fatigue. So my guess is that because you're literally rewiring those synapses, is that I rewired those synapses in my brain to go in a better direction that's more coordinated. And now like the rest of my body and the rest of my tissue is trying to get caught up to that. Which if you think about it, like if you look at turnover rates, right? So Van Loon has done some of this work, like protein turnover rates in the brain. Your brain probably turns over to an extremely high degree, like just functionally, just literally the content of it about every 30 days, which is mind-blowing. Now, again, we could argue they only did sampling of some proteins, and maybe it's not all the proteins. If you look at your right bicep, like it'll be completely turned over almost 100% in 90 days. So my guess is that your tissue turnover rates, if we couldn't measure them, go up astronomically high as your physical structure is trying to rewire around the direction your neurology is pointing it. Again, that's all incredibly hypothetical at this point.
Right. But it is interesting to think about it that way. And I mean, logically, that tracks with me for what I've kind of observed and experienced too. It's just shocking, truly shocking how fatiguing those exercises can be if you've ever had that experience.
Yeah. And I may have done a fair amount of work on this on myself early on, which I would not recommend. If you do things that your body does not like, you can definitely take yourself out of the game for 3 to 4 days and not feel any better at the end of it. Because I've done that a lot too, where in my head, I'm like, oh, this stupid, whatever, saccadic eye movement. It's fine. And then I'm like drilling on myself over in the corner. And then I'm out for 3 days and I'm no better at the end of it. I'm actually worse, right? The reality was, if I would have tested that exercise before I did a lot of reps of it, I would have realized, nope, this is not the best exercise. Instead, I tried to pound the square peg in the round hole and paid a cost for like 4 days.
Right. So back to figuring out minimum effective dose versus just trying to go for overall volume, which high volume just seems to be the thing that is the killer in all of this when you're dealing with sort of trying to find tolerance with something like POTS or one of these chronic illnesses I've observed.
Yeah, the pro is once you kind of get over that hump, and if you have a better aerobic base and you have better ability to handle stress, if you can find those exercises that do make you better, then I'll have people like frickin' hammer the shit out of them like 3, 4 times a day, assuming they can recover and assuming they're functional and they're not, lying on bed drilling on themselves, because then you can get that overlap of that frequency where that over time will become your new baseline. So at some point, frequency can be beneficial, but I 100% agree that you have to know when to scale it up, when the cost that you're paying can be repaid by the next time you do the drills, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Basically, frequency is really useful, but not in the very beginning when you're trying to figure out what baseline is.
Right. Yeah. Most people have to go the incredible opposite direction of very low frequency, very low volume, probably low intensity, right? Because you're trying to get under whatever that sort of mythical recovery capacity is, because you need to recover and you need to be able to do it again. You just can't accumulate much high quality work if you're out for like 4 or 5 days.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're kind of nearing a good stopping point, but I've got one more question I want to make sure that we covered, which was one person asked, what are the best exercises for when your HRV dips during illness or PMS?
Mm. So PMS, I haven't found anything, to be perfectly honest. And that's kind of a poor answer.
Fair.
The only thing I have found with that is doing any visceral work can help with PMS. If you can do it on yourself or foam roll that area, do ball, any type of midsection work I find can help with that. And what was the other part? You said increasing HRV for
after illness.
After illness. Not too much after illness. I mean, I was just in Amsterdam and got the flu over there, and I was like the lowest HRV I'd seen forever. It went from like 50 on Garmin to 16 overnight. My resting heart rate went from 43 to an average of 74 with spikes at like 110, just like lying in bed. There's some early data showing that maybe taking acetaminophen or things to try to reduce the fever is probably not best. Now, the caveat with that is if you do have a very high fever, then you're really messed up. Like, you definitely need to go to the hospital. You don't want a runaway fever or anything like that. So if you can monitor it, my bias, again, this is just my personal choice. I just chose to kind of ride it out for those 2 days. The data on that is very early on. Outside of that, sleep, hydration, normal stuff like that. Pull back on any stressors you can, because you only have a limited ability to recover from that. And then when you go back, I would say prioritize movement and not volume. So like the first training day I had was Tuesday, and I probably did, my working weights were probably what my normal starting warm-up was, and the total session was like 20 minutes. My whole goal was just get some tension on the muscle, do some movements, fix my posture, because I was like crunched over like this in bed. And that was it. Like, I wasn't trying to set any records, wasn't trying to do anything. And it was probably a full week, if I'm honest, before I even could probably train hard again after that. And that's after my numbers had normalized. So there is still some residual effects. And then also, as you get older, watch out for like large periods of almost no training, or what Tim Gabbert's research calls these load spikes. So if you have, for example, a high-level athlete, there's some data showing that if you dramatically increase their training volume, their risk of injury goes up quite a bit. Now, if you're progressively adding stuff, like, you don't usually run into that. But even for non-athletes, the biggest issue they'll run into is a period of time or sickness or vacation where they go from their normal training to like F all nothing. And then it's been a week and they go, I'm just going to start exactly where I left off. And then they, injure something. So I would say just, kind of gradually ramp back into it. I tell people like a week after, like, just don't have any expectations at the gym. Like, train as soon as you can. I think that's beneficial, but I would say don't really have any performance outcomes. And then obviously, look at your HRV, look at your total stress. Yeah, kind of a non-answer, but
No, but I mean, I think that's good for people to hear, right? Because I have that conversation with people a lot too. Like, well, what should I do post illness or during or after vacation? And I'm like, the first week at least, treat it like a deload. Observe what your body is doing, and if you're tracking things like HRV, pay attention to that. And whatever that says is going to give you information about what to do the next week, whether you can do a little bit more or whether, like, oh, that was actually probably a little aggressive for your system. Because again, to your point, some people have pretty good tolerance and some people don't. And sometimes it's a little bit of a crapshoot, even in the same person, just depending on what stage of life they're in or what the situation was.
yeah, the biggest issue I see is people who have a high stress period and then assume it won't affect their training.
Hmm.
And then if they're not carefully monitoring it, they'll just bury themselves. And they're like, oh, I don't know why everything went off a cliff all of a sudden. Because at some point, your body will be able to buffer some of those stressors. Like I've had more than one, God, I've had a ton of clients now hit huge PRs in the gym on what would be a red or a very sympathetic day. If you think about physiologically what's going on, yes, being more ramped up on the sympathetic side is usually better for acute performance. Now, the caveat is you may pay a higher level of cost from that. You can't do that all the time. So you kind of have to be a little bit careful because your nervous system is also under more load. So you have to watch your recruitment patterns, things like that. So I do think there is a lot more risk to doing that. But a lot of people assume that, oh, because I have high stress, my performance will be horrible. A lot of times that's not true. Your body can handle and buffer some stressors for a period of time. But again, you have to be wary of, okay, what is the cost? So if I have someone that's going to do that, almost invariably their next day is like, just do some light cardio, take the day off. Like, because I know it's going to be at least 24, 48 hours for them to even get remotely close to baseline. And if they're competitive and that's their competition day, yeah, great. Have a whole bunch of distress. Don't care. You can take the whole next week off, but if you're not, I want to prioritize, again, the quality training that's coming after that. Or you have a flare up in your HRV tanks, like, oh, screw it, I'm still going to go to the gym. It's like, you can, again, just be wary, modify it, and make sure your movement quality is still good. And then look the next day to see, okay, was the cost that I paid in retrospect, was it worth that session or not? And again, the purely individual choice depends on your training plan, depends on your goals, depending upon what you're trying to do. The hard part is there's almost no way to predict that 100% with an individual without running those experiments. Like for me, if my HRV is not even the greatest, I could go do hypertrophy stuff on upper body for 2 hours at the gym and I'll be fine the next day. But if I go in and I squat heavy, I'm effed for 2 days at least, right? Just, I don't know why. Heavy axial loading, my body just doesn't like it nearly as much. The only way I know that is by having run that experiment, like I don't know how many hundreds of times now over the last 10 years. Now, that's not a normal response. Most people look and go, well, 40,000 pounds of volume, should be horrible. You only did like 2,500 pounds of volume here, right? So it doesn't always come out on paper, but you kind of have to learn what is best, for you. Some people who have a flare up do better. Like if I just go to the gym and get some light movement in, good, I'm going to feel better the next day. Other people are like, no, I can't do that at all. I'm going to be F for 4 days after. And I haven't found any, maybe but I haven't found any way of predicting what situation they're going to be in without kind of running the experiment and seeing what happens.
Completely agree. Because actually, I'm glad you brought that up. Because, like, I'll just use myself as an example, but I know I've heard this anecdotally from clients too. Sometimes when I'm in a flare up, especially when I have kind of that parasympathetic, I believe it was like saturation that you kind of described.
Yep.
And I'm like lethargic and dizzy and nauseous. The thing that makes me feel better is going into the gym. And I'm not lifting heavy, but I look at whatever I had that day and I go, well, we're just going to try it with something that feels reasonable. That's not my maximal load, right? Like RP of 6 to 7. And I'll know pretty quickly if it's going to make me feel better or worse, because either I feel like I'm going to throw up and then I'm like, well, today's not the day. We'll try again tomorrow. Or after about 10, 15 minutes, I start to feel more like a normal human. So for me, it's kind of a crapshoot, but that's why sometimes I'll just try, because I'm going to get some biofeedback pretty quickly. And also, I'll say there's a difference. If I'm still above water enough to drive to the gym, that's going to be a very different choice than if I'm like lying on the couch to avoid passing out. So I think also context matters, but I think everyone's system responds a little differently, kind of like you described, and you just sort of have to mess around with it.
Yeah, I mean, in advanced clients who've been doing it for a while, you can look at their HRV score and see, are they too high parasympathetic or are they too low sympathetic? And that will change where we're going to start with them. So in your case, if someone goes really high parasympathetic, but they feel okay to go to the gym, they feel like they're not going to get, super dizzy or lightheaded. Okay, I'm thinking, okay, I want a sympathetic stressor to hit them because I want to try to get them back to baseline. But I also know they're probably historically going to be very work capacity intolerant. So having them do, 500-meter repeats on the rower or super heavy singles for repeats, probably not the best idea. So something I stole from Cal Dietz, University of Minnesota, is I'll have them take like a trap bar and stick it under the pins. And so they'll come to like 2 or 3 inches from the top. There's no load on it, but the pin is stopping the bar from coming all the way up. They're in a very strong position. And I'll tell them to do a hard isometric for 3 to 5 seconds. Just gradually pull up against the pins. When you hit the pins, count to 5, pull up as hard as you can, and then relax. Again, obviously making sure they're safe, making sure they don't have any dizzy response or any pressure response or anything like that. But if they can do that safely, we might do that for 3 to 4 rounds, do some light aerobic stuff, and call it a day. So what am I doing? I'm wanting to get a super high sympathetic stimulus, but I'm only doing it in an isometric. I'm not doing any load. I'm not doing any eccentrics. I'm not applying any tearing down of the muscle tissue. I'm not even applying a lot of work. I just want to try to push their system and try to get it back to normal. Now, again, if they're highly sympathetic, all right, we might do more parasympathetic things. It might be a zone 2 cardio or cardiac development or just some light mobility, maybe do some light bodybuilding stuff. It's probably going to be more of that stuff I would gear it towards. Again, trying to get them a little bit more back to baseline and not dig a bigger hole.
Right. Again, it's so much of this is going to ultimately be context matters, but I think that's super helpful for people to hear. So I don't want to hold you up for too long. So just as we start to wrap, is there anything on this topic that we didn't cover that you think is important for people to know?
I would say the biggest thing is just your body is your own experiment, and how you respond to different things will determine what to do. And I think HRV is like super useful for that because some stressors are also unconscious, right? Over time, you may not always know what is causing you to be more stressed. With HRV, you can kind of figure that out. Not that you want to be super worried about it or whatever, but to me, it's super useful to have a marker of, oh, okay, all these things you did yesterday, here's the cost on your nervous system. Cool. Okay, that probably gives me some good feedback, just like the tachometer on the car of how fast was I revving the engine. Now I can look at the performance I got from that and determine, oh, okay, that was probably a good use of my time. Or maybe my performance on that day was really horrible and the cost was super high. Probably don't want to repeat that again. I want to find things that have, pretty good output that aren't as stressful on my nervous system. And sometimes you can't always feel that either. Like I've had, days where I'm like, I feel a little tired. Oh, HRV is great. Cool. Okay. Or vice versa. Most of the time I'm relatively within the ballpark now, but not always. And sometimes there's other stressors that people may not have accounted for, especially psychological stressors, other things like that. They will still show up in your heart rate variability score, and you can kind of get those things on the map that you may have completely missed otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for doing this with me. Before I let you go, for people who want to connect with you, learn more about your certifications and your trainings and all of the things, where is a good place for people to connect with you, find you, learn more about you?
Yeah, best place is probably just the website. It sounds so old school now, but it's just MikeTNelson.com. And then if you go to the top, there's a little newsletter button. You can sign up to the newsletter, which is free. I usually send out content daily, mostly geared towards body comp, performance, longevity, that kind of stuff. And then if they have any questions, they can just hit reply via the newsletter, and I'll get back to them. We do have some stuff on Instagram once in a while, which is Dr. Mike T. Nelson. And then if they're interested in the HRV education course or the Flex Diet Cert or the PhysFlex Cert, we have all that information on the website also.
Excellent. Well, I will link to those things in the show notes, and thank you for doing this.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.